Let's go. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are. Rook takes rook. There are no checks in this position. The answer is. Rook takes rook. King takes rook. Rook to d7, check. King to a6. Pawn takes pawn. King takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Next, threats in this position are. Rook takes pawn. The checks are. Queen to h4, check. The answer is. Queen to h4, check. g3. Queen takes bishop. Next, here are the threats. Bishop takes bishop. Pawn takes pawn, check. Checks in this position are. Pawn takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is. Bishop takes bishop. King takes bishop. Pawn takes pawn. King takes pawn. King to d4. Another one, the threats are. Pawn takes knight. Bishop takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The puzzle is solved using. Bishop to g5. Queen to b8. Pawn takes knight. Another puzzle, here are the threats. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is. c6. Bishop takes bishop. Pawn takes queen. Next puzzle, the threats are. Knight takes pawn. Rook takes rook. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Knight to d7, check. Knight to g4, check. Rook to d5, check. The puzzle is solved using. Knight to d7, check. King to e6. Knight takes rook, check. Let's see the next puzzle. Threats in this position are. Queen takes queen. Rook takes bishop. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook to f1, check. Rook to e3, check. The best move in puzzle position is. Queen to a8. Queen to f6, check. King to g8. e6. Queen to e4, check. Another puzzle, the threats are. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The puzzle is solved using. Knight to g3. King to g8. d5. Queen to b6, check. King to h1. Let us go to the next puzzle. Threats in this position are. Rook takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Bishop to h7, check. The answer is. Bishop to h7, check. King to h8. Rook takes queen. Knight takes queen. Bishop takes knight. Next, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Pawn takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. King to b4. c5, check. King to b5. Next puzzle, the threats are. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Here are the checks. Queen to g1, check. Queen to h1, check. The answer is. Queen to c7. Bishop takes pawn, check. King to f8. King to g1. Queen takes knight. Another one, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes bishop. Checks in puzzle position are. Queen to a5, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Bishop takes bishop. Knight takes bishop. Queen to a5, check. Queen to d2. Queen takes knight. Next, threats in this position are. Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes bishop. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is. Queen takes bishop. One more, the threats are. Knight takes bishop. Knight takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Answer to this puzzle is. Knight takes bishop. Queen takes rook. Queen to a1, check. One more, threats in this position are. Rook takes pawn. The checks are. Rook to e2, check. Rook to c1, check. The answer is. Rook takes pawn. Rook to a6. King to e4. Rook to a4, check. King to f3. Let us go to the next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are. Queen takes rook. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn, check. Checks in this position are. Rook takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is. Queen to a3. Queen to g7, check. Rook to b7. Rook to e2. Rook takes queen. Next puzzle, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes bishop check. The checks are: rook takes bishop check. Answer to this puzzle is: rook takes bishop check. King takes rook. Bishop to d5. King to d6. c4. Next puzzle, threats in puzzle position are: there are no threats in this position. Checks in this position are: rook to a6 check. The puzzle is solved using: rook to a7, g4, rook to a6 check. Queen takes rook. Rook takes queen check. Another puzzle, threats in this position are: there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The puzzle is solved using: king to d2, knight takes rook, knight takes rook, knight to f3 check, king to e3, rook to g8, knight to f5, knight takes pawn, knight takes knight. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position: pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn check, knight takes bishop check, knight takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position: knight takes pawn check, knight takes bishop check. The best move in puzzle position is: pawn takes pawn, rook takes pawn, knight takes bishop check, rook takes knight, rook takes rook. Next puzzle, here are threats in puzzle position: bishop takes pawn, rook takes pawn, rook takes pawn. Here are the checks: bishop to e5 check, rook to f3 check, rook to g2 check. The puzzle is solved using: rook to e2, knight to d6, bishop to e5 check, queen takes bishop check, rook takes queen. Next, here are threats in puzzle position: pawn takes knight, bishop takes knight check. Here are checks in puzzle position: bishop takes knight check. Here is the solution to the puzzle: bishop takes knight check, bishop to d2, bishop takes bishop check, queen takes bishop, pawn takes knight. One more, here are threats in puzzle position: rook takes rook check. Here are checks in puzzle position: rook takes rook check. Here is the solution to the puzzle: rook takes rook check, king to f6, rook to g8, king takes pawn, rook takes rook. Another puzzle, the threats are: there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is: king to g5, f6, king takes pawn, king to f4, king to g6. Next puzzle, threats in this position are: rook takes rook, rook takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position: rook to c5 check, queen to c4 check. Answer to this puzzle is: rook to a5. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.